Support for this and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? That sounds pretty good. Okay, all right. So I want to welcome everybody to Gettysburg National Military Park. My name's Angie Atkinson. I'm a supervisory park ranger here at Gettysburg. Before we jump into some obviously very heavy subject matter, for those of you that have hung with us through the winter lecture series, my gosh, when it was established, what, 2013? Somewhere back there. You may have noticed that I tend to give these programs on Super Bowl Sunday. It is a thing. I mean, it started completely innocuous, and I just kind of started to notice that I would do the program, and there would happen to be a football game later. And then I actually one year did a program and was able to end with Go Ravens because they were actually in the Super Bowl. And so then it was sort of like, okay, do I always have to be on Super Bowl Sunday? So I talked with my boss. I'm like, yo, this is becoming a thing. Like, can we just change it up? And he's like, yes, we're going to change it up. So last year I didn't do one. I was working down in Richmond, Virginia for the battlefield parks down there. I was on a detail, so helping them out. And we were like, yeah, it's not going to be enough time to get anything together. So my boss is like, don't worry. When you get back next year, we will hook you up. And so he had the schedule all arranged. He said, you know what, Angie's on Super Bowl Sunday, and he moved me to February 2nd, not realizing that was Super Bowl Sunday. So I think from this point on, I'm just going to embrace it. All right, so next year, I'll probably be doing a lecture. You can probably mark it in your calendar that it'll be on Super Bowl Sunday. Now, I did also learn today that it was Groundhog Day, which I did not realize until someone showed me the photo. So evidently, for those of you that are very into this, it sounds like spring is supposedly right around the corner. I give no predictions, I'm just kind of conveying that. Okay, so with that, I do want to thank everybody for coming out today. I know that a lot of these topics many times are related to the Battle of Gettysburg, and while this one seems quite distant from the battle itself, I think it is directly related, because why in the world is this war happening? Well, in part because of much of this action. Couple of things to note as we're going through this program. There will be words that come upon the screen that we don't use today. And what I did while I was putting this program together was not look to do things gratuitously, but for an educational value and to help convey the stories of the people that I am attempting to tell and talk about, and the gravity of the situation. And in many times, words are important, and they do carry a lot of weight. So you will see some words up here that we don't commonly use today. There is some subject matter within this program that can be difficult to write. I can tell you that there was a lot of cut and paste and editing, and how does one phrase this? But there's some subject matter too that can be disturbing to individuals. So I do just want to put that out there as well. As I say in all programs, not specifically those that deal with heavy subject matter, if at any point you need to leave, please feel free to do so. I hope that you will stay. I think that we're going to cover a lot of different things here. By no means is this program the end-all be-all on the interstate slave trade. I could have spent weeks talking about this subject matter. And so what I had to do was kind of hit some of the larger points, the bigger illustrative points. There are a number of great books that drill down into these things, some of them published recently, some of them published actually many years ago. But nonetheless, we're going to try and give everyone kind of a broad overview of what is happening in this, as many historians refer to it, this second middle passage. So I'm going to step up here and hope that that's going to help my clicker. You've all never seen me this high above the podium before. And we'll continue through this program. So, there we go. Okay. From your grade school years, probably, you were probably in a history classroom, a civics classroom, a social studies classroom, and talked about the transatlantic slave trade. Some would refer to part of this trading as the triangular trade, where objects, goods, commodities are moving in various different ways and fashions through a number of European, African, and then what would eventually be British, then to American colonies and or states. Over the course of this transatlantic slave trade, there's going to be about between 10 and 12 million individuals that are going to be transported across the Atlantic Ocean. It's called, in a sense, the first Middle Passage. Some will refer to it as the triangular trade. You can roughly see that shape designed by the movement of manufactured goods and textiles to Africa, human cargo from Africa to the West Indies, and then up into what would be eventually the English colonies and then the United States, and then other goods back over to Europe, all profiting from a variety of things, whether it be actual commodities, goods, products, but also humans. There were, prior to the 1600s, probably no more than a few 100,000 Africans that were taken to the Americas. By the 17th century, though, this starts to increase, and by the 18th century, it really starts to take on new vigor. Here we go. This Middle Passage was notorious for its brutality, the conditions of the ships. You can imagine it took a great deal of time to cross an ocean, and you're only doing this by ship. There were individuals, as you can see by the illustrations here, packed very tightly on many of these vessels. Usually it was hard to breathe, the sanitation was atrocious. Obviously, these individuals have been removed from their homes, so there's going to be discontent. No one is necessarily agreeing to do this. They've been stripped from a land that they've known and now moved to a place where they have no idea what is going to happen to them. If it was allowed, these individuals could maybe go up on deck for a few hours a day to breathe fresh air, but then it's back into the hold. This is to maintain control. As you look at the sheer numbers of individuals on these vessels, it could be very easily seen by the traders that any insurrection would spell doom to them. And so it was very important that they maintain control, keep these individuals as chained up and as immovable as possible. By January of 1807, there is now a self-sustaining population of slaves in the United States, mostly in the South. There's going to be a push from the Congress in the United States to end the African slave trade, and that would become effective January 1st, 1808. Now, that is simply that transatlantic element from Africa, or Europe to Africa to the West Indies to America. This doesn't prevent an internal slave trade, and that's what will soon start to be generated by the lack of this the transatlantic opportunity. And so the map on the right is what that would start to look like, and we'll have a few more maps in the program. But you can see that there's going to be two main routes. There's going to be an inter route, or an overland route, and then there's going to be a route by waterway. So still using vessels, ships, using the land itself, but the shift is now going to be not importing individuals from African countries, but importing individuals from other states and areas and other cities and towns within the United States. What starts to happen is there starts to be kind of a genesis to get individuals to, number one, move south. Now, there's going to be a shift in some agriculture and planting, but there's going to be these internal traders that see this for them as a money-making opportunity. But what they need to do is they need to generate interest in their product. So one option is for a planter to say, okay, I am done with my tobacco crop in the eastern shore of Maryland, and I'm going to move everyone that I have and myself, because the land is just not producing as it once was, and I'm going to make money elsewhere. The traders kind of know that that's a large task, and that many people are probably not going to want to up and move their entire existence and life to a different part of the country. So it would be easier for them to act as kind of the conduit to get slaves from one area of the United States to another. So what they're going to do is they're going to start sending out advertisements for this service, if you will. And what they would start to do is they would start to say things and advertise things such as this, quote, "Call on us before making other purchases, as we flatter ourselves that we can furnish you Negroes as cheap as you can buy them. Call and buy before the present stock is picked over, as some are of the opinion that the first show as a fresh lot is $100 the advantage. Call and make your purchases to gather your crop, and then call again quick to buy to make another crop. By those means, if you will, keep your purchases for 10 years. There is no telling how much you may be worth. This is the true road to wealth. And if you neglect the present offer of becoming wealthy, it is your fault and not ours, as the road is laid out plainly." So they are marketing to these individuals on a number of levels. Number one, we can do this just as easy as you. And so we can move these individuals and you don't have to worry about it. There is a limited supply. Call before that stock is picked over. And as we're going through this program, keep in mind that the phrasings, the terminologies that they are using, to a degree, we would talk about these things in a business as if it's an actual good, okay, a tangible, inanimate good. They are talking about people. That is a very clear distinction that we need to make. That while one could purchase, in our time, a podium or, anything, a marketable good, they are talking about people in much the same fashion, using a number of business terms rather than what I might say are human terms surrounding them. The fresh lot is the advantage. Call and make your purchases to gather your crop. They're not talking about anything agricultural at that point. They're talking about the number of individuals one might have on the plantation. It has nothing to do with any sort of vegetable or farm type produce. Call again quick to buy another. Keep these for 10 years, for they may be worth something, but most importantly, what they're saying is, it's no telling how much you may be worth. So speaking right to those individuals who are looking to gain wealth and opportunity from the sale of other individuals. Another individual will be quoted, "This traffic and the men who operate it help to encourage consumerism and make market activity and the speculation in commodities a greater part of people's everyday lives." This trade, this interaction between the slave trader, the broker, the planter, the buyer, was not done within a small group. It was very broad. There were a lot of individuals that had their hands directly, indirectly, and tangentially tied to this market. And so these traders who were starting to see this opportunity, the transatlantic trade is not possible, but the internal trade is, are going to start to use business practices. They're going to utilize advances in communication and transportation. They will develop company organizations. They will improve accounting techniques when recording profits. Again, not by cotton or food produce necessarily, but for people. They are standardizing commodities, and we'll actually get to that a little bit later. And they are creative in their marketing practices and customer service. To some degree, a little bit scary how many familiar phrases maybe we use today that they were using back then to discuss people. So who are these individuals? The traders, the slave traders, the human traders, are going to be individuals that are going to advance on this opportunity. They are going to keep markets at both ends of the trade route, those that are mostly in port cities in the upper south, places like Alexandria and Baltimore. And then also markets, well-known markets, unfortunately, in places like New Orleans, Louisiana, Mobile, Natchez, Mississippi, and plenty of other places in between. Some of these individuals had employees that were both salary and commission. And some will estimate that these individuals, by the time all things are said and done, had moved close to 600,000 people. 600,000 people from the upper south, which is that area of Virginia, to the lower south, which is the area of Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, in the decades prior to the Civil War. There was a season for this commerce that for some they found buying power over the summer. Slaves, unfortunately, individuals being held in pens for weeks and months until it was time to be sold. Fall in the deep south seemed to be one of the primary buying seasons. Why? Well, a planter at that point would have harvested their crop. They wouldn't have. Their slaves would have harvested their crop. And at that point, they would have known how much money they made off of the sale of that cotton. And that cotton heading north, maybe heading over to England. Now they know what is in their account, how many people did not make it through that harvest season, and how many more people they would need for the next, because it never stops. That cycle, that cyclical cycle of that cotton farming never stops, and that is the planter's, to a degree, main source of wealth. Rarely though, and this is a very interesting aspect of this interstate slave trade, rarely would a slave owner, the plantation owner, the estate owner, interact with the slave trader. There was an understanding, maybe a not admittance, but an understanding that the dealing in humans was something that they did not want to be close to. Even though they were living in a paternalistic culture, even though these owners were looking at individuals as goods and merchandise, there was something about getting just a little too close to the actual sale, the sale of a human being. So the plantation owners, many times, not always, remember, there's always an exception to the rule, but many times they would send a broker or an agent to handle the purchasing of said individuals with instructions by the planter to do so. I need X number of these, I need X number of those. Please keep in mind, look for this type of individual. But the planter rarely ever entering the actual slave market. So let's see. In the early start of the interstate slave trade. Now, keep in mind, when the transatlantic slave trade ended, it was not like an instant on-off switch and all of a sudden the interstate slave trade began. There had to be a shift into a different type of economy and commerce. As though the opportunities presented themselves for some of these individuals, they would jump on them. One of the largest traders that is going to operate in the very early years of the interstate slave trade is Austin Woolfolk. He is originally from Augusta, Georgia, and by 1815, he had been working in the slave trading business early in his career, but by 1815, he had realized that there's opportunity, and he would be working out of a tavern in Maryland's Eastern Shore. He would have a lot of slaves that was purchased. He'd send them by coffle to relatives in Augusta, Georgia. So they would be acting as employees, if you will. And then they would be sold to individual farmers. So a very kind of one-on-one type of sale, not a large-scale market or business type of sale. In just 4 years, though, Woolfolk would realize that he could do a lot more. than what he was doing. He had enough business. He had made enough connections and enough ties that he could do business, and he moved to Baltimore to take advantage of the fact that it was a growing port city right on the Chesapeake Bay, and he's going to shift away from what had previously been a land-based trade. So when I say the word coffle, which is again not a term we often use, that is a group of individuals that are force-marched to another location. They're walking, maybe the infirm are riding, and maybe the small children are riding, but the idea is that they are being moved from one place to another overland with individuals overseeing that movement. Woolfolk is going to take advantage of water, and he's going to now utilize water to transport these individuals. He will shift away from the land-bound routes and move to the open waters of the Atlantic seaboard. It is slightly more expensive. Obviously, you have a vessel, a ship, to be concerned with. But the advantages to him were numerous. It greatly reduced the time in transit. You can imagine walking X number of miles a day, and by water, you could go that much further. It would be lower maintenance costs, as the men, women, and children no longer needed to be housed. They could be placed right on the boat. Previous to that, if you have a coffle, you have to put people somewhere, at least for the moment, before you send them downriver, as they would be called, even though it might be by land, downriver to the deep south. By water, shipments had a quick turnaround time. You could get back a lot faster by water than you could going by land. And in Woolfolk's mind, his human cargo was more protected. In a vessel, they would not be out in the elements, whereas by walking, you are not provided any type of shelter. You exist out in the environment. This is not a humanitarian thing. This is a profit thing. For these individuals, many times it made no difference that they were providing shelter for humans. What they wanted to do was provide shelter for their merchandise, so that way they did not lose money. It was not to make anybody more comfortable or provide them any sort of protection from anything like that. It was to provide protection for their pocketbooks. And a ship could manage many more bodies than supervision by foot could. Woolfolk will also, in Baltimore, he will purchase a residence with an office and an adjoining slave jail on Pratt Street, right downtown. Right kind of in the area of Camden Yards, along that corridor down in downtown Baltimore. What this does is it also, he now has a business office for this. It legitimizes him in this business, in this institution. Relatives, again, acting as agents on the Eastern Shore in Augusta, Georgia, and now New Orleans, because another port city, you're coming from one port city in Baltimore down to another in New Orleans, are going to get set and ready for business. From there, they will cover, at least in Maryland, almost every town and county, looking for individuals to buy and sell and trade. By the 1820s, again, this is the early part of the interstate slave trade, the Woolfolks were dominating this industry. An image here, if we can get it. Maybe not. There we go. So again, an image of human cargo aboard a ship. Depending, each slave trader had their own way of doing things. Okay, when I make a statement, keep in mind this may be related to one individual or two individuals. As a whole, there was not necessarily like a standard operating procedure. Everybody's doing this, to their own business practices. But some on vessels would ensure that men and women were separated in different holds, men in one, women in another. Shipments would be monitored by agents or members of the Woolfolk family if they were going down with them. As I said, each trader makes a decision best suited for their business. Some shipments of these men, women, and children are simply monitored by a bill of lading. a bill of sale. This is the shipment. It's X number of people, and it's simply meant to go down to whatever port it was slated for. As in business, though, things change, times change, and there's soon going to be individuals who are going to implement process improvements. And these individuals, John Armfield and Isaac Franklin, are going to do just that. By 1828, John Armfield and Isaac Franklin soon will create their trading firm, and they've been doing this. In fact, Franklin has been doing this for a number of years individually out of his home in Tennessee. Armfield as well. Maybe meeting in Natchez, Mississippi, maybe meeting in New Orleans, however they were able to connect. You have to imagine there's probably a network of these individuals, and everybody knew who the other was. They will soon decide to join together in this partnership. And what they will do is they will first send slaves from Tennessee down to Natchez, Mississippi and New Orleans. Once they decide to partner, they will move their base of operations to Alexandria, Virginia, then part of the District of Columbia, and they will utilize overland and water routes to move their products. If you've been to Alexandria, you may have actually walked by the office building that these men used at some point. There we go. Located on Duke Street, still exists today, though the building in its entirety does not. The main office structure is there. So the picture on the left, a version more appropriate to the century, and then the white structure in the middle of the more modern photograph is what exists today. There was a large yard of about 300 square feet surrounded by a high whitewashed wall. You can see that. Let's see if I get I want to do the pointer. Oh wait. You can see the white wall in the old photograph right in the middle, and several outbuildings. There were separate covered yards, 2-story buildings for the men and women, a kitchen, a hospital, and a tailor shop where clothing was made and prepared for the slaves once at auction. Well, Woolfolk was one of the first to focus on the coastal trade, the waterway trade. It was Franklin and Armfield who will actually take it a step further, and they will purchase their own ships to do this. They will own 3 brigs, the Tribune, the Uncas, and the Isaac Franklin. The latter of which, the Isaac Franklin, was designed specifically to haul human cargo. It wasn't a ship retrofitted to take people from one place to the other. It was designed to take humans from one place to the other in a good commodity bondage capacity. For them, the advantage in shipping not only cut costs, but they could also bring goods on the way back. So they could bring back sugar, molasses, whiskey, and cotton to the north. They took out the middleman, and they allowed themselves to continue multiple routes of trade the entire time. They also capitalized on something called a packet line. Typically, traders would wait until their ships were full. They wanted the most potential to maximize their profit. For them, though, this could cause significant delay. And before the ship sets sail, remember, individuals are being housed in pens or jails. You can imagine that those conditions are not conducive to health and wellness. What Franklin and Armfield decide to do is they decide that they will not wait until the ship is completely full, that they will go ahead and run the ship with as many individuals as they can possibly fit in the ship, and then let it set sail. This ensured that the buyers and sellers knew when the ship would leave and approximately when the ship would arrive. This was a standardization of this trade. You know, Woolfolk was kind of waiting for whenever things filled up. Franklin and Armfield are making it much more regimented. The Tribune could hold about 180 people, and it will leave typically with 75 to 100. The manifests indicate that the shipments would rarely, if ever, exceed 150. So they're obviously operating at a loss, if you want to look at maximum capacity. But for the Isaac Franklin, again specifically made for this, it carried per trip roughly 254 individuals. They ran advertisements at their location in New Orleans and marketed the fact that they could also travel upstream to Natchez, Mississippi. So they're broadening their potential sale area. They offered their jail facilities to other smaller traders who might need to quarter or house their merchandise. In quote, servants that are intended to be shipped will at any time be received for safekeeping at 25 cents per day. So if you were one of the smaller traders and you needed the housing, but you also needed the ship, Franklin and Armfield were there, and they were able to provide this. By 1833, their ships were were leaving once a month. 2 years later, they were leaving on the 1st and the 15th of each month. By 1835, it is estimated that Franklin and Armfield were sending well over 1,000 people downriver each year for the last 15 years. That is not an exact number by any stretch of the imagination. Accounting is quite difficult, especially if there are not available records or not as clear records as I think today one would like to truly be able to understand this process. But one of their accounting ledgers indicated that they were, at one point, their accounts receivable totaled about $400,000. And that's in antebellum money. To give you an idea of the routes, another version of this, again, via the Atlantic seaboard, over here to the right, the or overland routes going right through kind of the center of the map there, through Knoxville, through Nashville, down through the center of Mississippi, which is an old Native American path known as the Natchez Trace, to the city of Natchez, and then depending what else was needed, down to New Orleans, a big port city. To go overland, it took about 7 to 8 weeks because you could only walk about 20 miles a day. Now, keep in mind, people are ill, people are infirm, people are not made to do this. And that is an average. There will be delays, there will be stops and starts, there will be environmental factors. By boat out of one of the ports, say Baltimore, for example, it took about 3. And from St. Louis down to your Natchez and Louisiana or New Orleans ports, you're only looking at a handful of days to get there. Some traders, like we said, went with their inventory, others sent employees, and still others were simply sending paperwork to go back and forth. The overland route, this would be commonly seen. We refer to the coffle, and this is a rendering of what that might look like. An English traveler came across a coffle near New River, Virginia, and noted this. He said, quote, "It was a camp of Negro slave drivers, just packing up to start, that had about 300 slaves with them, who had bivouacked the previous night in chains in the woods. They had a caravan of 9 wagons and single-horse carriages for the purpose of conducting the white people, and any of the blacks that should fall lame. The female slaves were sitting on logs of wood, and a great many black children were warming themselves at the fires. In front of them all, and prepared for the march, stood in double files about 200 male slaves manacled and chained to each other. This gentleman, quote, had never seen so revolting a sight before." Some of these coffles would be organized, some would just be individuals walking. Sometimes there would be the men who would be chained because that was a threat of insurrection and overpowering. Remember, you only have a handful of traders going with these groups. Single women would probably follow behind, followed behind by mothers and children who are not going to be able to walk with the pace as quickly, and who are thought to be less of a flight risk and less of an insurrection type of risk. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that, as one of the individuals would later recount, one of the enslaved individuals would later recount, a Again, there are things that are not simply for creature comfort. There are things that are for the benefit of these white traders. And when one of the enslaved individuals recounted that some of the women were permitted to occasionally ride, it was not out of the kindness of anyone's heart. It was out of an individual's interest in that woman. And rape and sexual abuse during these was quite common. It cannot be unsaid. I mean, it cannot be overlooked. The same thing in the holds of ships. The men and women were separated. Many of the traders would argue that it kept men and women away from each other. No buyer was going to want a slave who might be pregnant. A buyer did not want a slave who might have a venereal disease. A buyer did not want a slave who was incapacitated in any way, shape, or form. And so sometimes, many times, the sexes are separated, but then there are other times where individuals are further separated. And that is many times for the benefit of the captain, the traders, to do what they wanted to, when they wanted to, with these individuals. One enslaved individual would write that one of the women remained in the cabin on the voyage from Richmond to New Orleans. It was not for her comfort. So you have these larger traders who are moving massive numbers of individuals. You also have what one might call as a mid-level trader. You're looking at the account book to the left and then open page here to the right of the Bolton, Dickens and Company, centered in Lexington, but then also having some markets in branches in Memphis, St. Louis, Natchez, and New Orleans. They are all around. It's much like you have big corporations today and then you have smaller businesses. Much the same with this interstate slave trade. One of the traders who you will be familiar with, at least on a level, if we can, there we go, is Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was a leading, prior to the Civil War, he is a leading slave trader out of Memphis, Tennessee by the 1850s. Annual profits about $50,000, and at his peak, likely upwards of $100,000. He will run advertisements from, again, his base in Memphis, Tennessee, as far away as Charleston, South Carolina, with what he is able to buy, trade, sell. He's announcing his inventory in the New Orleans markets, and he would even advertise that his slave pen in Memphis was, quote, capable of containing 300, and for comfort, neatness, and safety is the best range of any in the Union. Those are the traders, and this is who they are trading. For those who were enslaved, the devastating reality was that at any moment of any day, they themselves or members of their family could be sold off with absolutely no choice in the matter. And unfortunately, children had no choice but to acknowledge that this is part of the reality. Parents as well. Over the course of this interstate slave trade, over 2/5 of the slaves were children younger than age 15, 1/3 younger than age 10. Lewis Hughes, born in 1832, was age 6 when sold for the first time. He was then sold 3 more times over the course of the next 6 years, before being sent up for auction in Richmond and then bought by a planter in Mississippi. He is now age 12. In this scenario, he has basically grown up with 0 family, 0 parents, 0 guidance, 0 care in a familial aspect. One study estimates that 10% of teenagers in the Upper South ended up being removed by the interstate slave trade. Though not as frequent, there are instances of children as young as 2 to 10 months being offered up for sale. Keep in mind that infants, babies, quite young individuals are not an advantage to a planter. That child is not worth anything. They can't do anything. And so they are also not allowing the mother to work as well, because someone has to care for this individual. So a buyer and a seller are very aware of children attached to a mother. Sometimes children are sold off very quickly because it allows for an easier sale of the mother. Sometimes children are sold off as addendums to some of these sales. Sometimes they are sold off to control the sale. If the mother is potentially going for sale and the mental mind games that sellers play, many false promises, but many of the statements made that they might sell their child to so-and-so, knowing that, or at least purporting that, said individual might take care of them better than somewhere else. Now, is that true? No. Probably have no intention of worrying about the care for that child. What do they worry about? The profit margin on this individual. Some buyers would look for children that are orphans. Many traders were able to find a number of children that were orphans. They took that term very loosely. So any child that could be removed from their parents basically became an orphan. With this, parents unfortunately had the unfathomable task of preparing their children for sale. Think about that statement. We have to prepare ourselves for a lot in life. I find that I literally cannot imagine how one does that and what that would be like. But they had no choice. If they were going to attempt to provide their child the most chance of success, if you can call it that within this market, then their hands were forced and they had to. Thomas Jones would recall his parents talking about the possibility of being sold, and he would say, quote, "About our upcoming misery, and they lifted up their voices and wept aloud, and they spoke of our being torn from them and sold off to the dreaded slave trader." Henry Box Brown remembered that his mother would, quote, "place him on her knee, and pointing to the forest trees adjacent, now being stripped of their thicker foliage by autumnal winds, would say to me, 'My son, as yonder leaves are stripped off the trees of the forest, so are the children of slaves swept away from them by the hands of cruel tyrants.'" Some parents are going to emphasize being stoic. As much as you can, let nothing bother you. Others would couch it in terms of placating the new owner, the new master, the new mistress. Be good. Be a good listener. Don't do anything to get yourself in trouble. For these children, many would now have to place their survival in the hands of complete strangers. The hope that traders would provide basic care without nefarious intentions, that their new owner would do much the same, or that those enslaved men and women with them would be able to open their arms and their hearts to care for a child, and of course the children not realizing that those adults may have been in that same position years before. And if it was the parents being sold off, as a woman from Arkansas was, they turned to other adults in hopes that they would care for their children. This woman would say, quote, "Be a mother to my children, will you? I hate to leave them, poor little things, but I can't help myself. Their poor father is dead, and only God knows what will become of them when Master Bill and Miss Tessie dies." But no matter how many parents prepared their children, nothing mitigated the tearing of the bonds of family. A 15-year-old boy who was being sold in Louisiana was described as this, quote, "The little fellow appeared to realize his condition, and when the big tear rolled down his cheek, would meekly brush it aside and hold up his head with an air and manner which won him the sympathies of a great number of spectators." though, as soon as he was sold, his feelings were vented in a flood of tears. For young girls, unfortunately, up on the auction block, rape was prevalent. Celia, a 14-year-old girl from Missouri, was raped by the man who purchased her. He was 60 years old. A young girl in Georgia was made to lay upon a table where multiple men raped her before letting her go. The mental, sexual, and emotional trauma that they faced was never forgotten. It never left. One individual wrote, quote, "The terrors of the scene return with painful vividness upon my memory." One of them said that upon remembering their former mother and family, quote, "It came to me more and more plainly that I would never see her again. Young and lonely as I was, I could not help crying oftentimes for hours." And this is where many of these individuals are headed. For many times, that's simply the sale or the extrication of a family member. Now we move down to the market, to the actual market. There we go. This is a map I've actually used before in programs. Some of you may be familiar with it. It is a map that runs from Natchez to New Orleans. So if you look at the map on the left, on the very top left side, you'll see kind of pink and blue parcels of land. So it starts with Natchez, it moves down to the border of Mississippi, Louisiana, and you'll notice that the colors begin to change. So you're moving out of cotton plantations, timber plantations, more into the rice and the sugarcane plantations. That's why the colors change. I blew up part of the map. It's the top part. You'll see two circles. On my computer, you could actually read the names. But the reason I circled those two, Natchez being at the very top left of the blue and red, those are two plantations owned by a gentleman named John McMurrin. Now, John McMurrin was a planter in Natchez, Mississippi. I used to work at his estate home in Natchez. It's a site owned by the Park Service. John McMurrin is from Franklin County, just right over the way here. John McMurrin, like many individuals, was looking to make wealth, was looking to become a wealthy individual, and moved from, had family in the McConnellsburg area, Franklin County area, moved south. He would marry into money, and then he would eventually end up owning 5 plantations throughout this area. The top plantation known as Morrow, and the plantation to the bottom known as Riverside. So sometimes we tend to think of this as being far removed from those of us in the north, whether living here, native to here, etc. But I think John McMurrin is about as close as we can get to a local example of the fact that anybody could move and anybody could search for a money-making opportunity, and no one, in a sense, was beneath using the commodification of human beings to do that. When you get to the market, the prices are going to be set in a very interesting way. How do you price a human? How do you come up with a cost? How do you come up with a number? There we go. You have to create a market, and it's all arbitrary. There is no book that says so-and-so at age 40 who can do this, who weighs this much, who is about this tall, should be priced at this. It was all subjective, absolutely subjective. It was subjective to the climate, meaning the market climate, the business climate. It was subjective to the needs of the buyers. It was subjective to the needs of the sellers. It was subjective down to the person, what the person in front of you that's being sold. How is this person going to rate compared to someone else? The prices could be set according to age, gender, height, weight, skin color. You will notice in many advertisements that adjectives were attached to individuals. Extra men, likely girls, ordinary or second-rate girls. Extra and likely meaning higher value. Ordinary, there might be, from their perception, for whatever the market is indicating, something wrong with them, or they are not as apt or able to do X, Y, or Z for whomever is buying. Many times individuals slated for the fields could reach $1,000 or more per person, while those that might be a little bit older, not as much. I think if you look at the price on the left here, you'll notice that as a gentleman, 80 years of age for $100, second from the top, and a gentleman who's 100 years of age for $40, and a woman who is 90 for $115. Notice if you go down a little bit, there's one woman and child. She is only valued at $735. We talked about the children a little bit ago. The sellers, the traders, would oftentimes get the planters, the owners to think about what the market is bearing at different times. And one would say this, quote, "Our market is still dull, but very few number one Negroes offering second and third rate hard to sell. If you have any number one Negroes on hand, we would advise sending them in as they are wanted now." The traders, though, have a reality before them. They just can't, well, I mean, they can. Let's be real that they can. They just can take somebody, okay? It is easier for them. It is less effort for them if they have buy-in by the individual that they are selling. And that is another unfortunate reality. So juxtaposed against lists like this is the fact that individuals, the slave traders are hoping that individuals will have some buy-in to this process. Whether or not they are told that their family won't be broken up, that might increase some buy-in. Whether they're told that their children might be sent to so-and-so, who is a kinder individual, but again, who knows, that might get buy-in to them. Traders would offer last chances to say goodbye, empty promises of good masters downriver, and foregoing of shackles if one behaved. For those caught in the web, though, in reality it offered nothing. There was nothing that any of these individuals was going to get. Traders, though, constantly needed to familiarize themselves with the market and understand the relativity of prices related to the product of the area. They had to, quote, reflect the market valuation of people to project a valuation of people. But the toll was significant on the product. I don't think anyone can expect, whether it be by boat or over land, that this was in any way, shape, or form an easy journey. The physical and mental toll was significant, and traders would soon, once they get to the market, need to get their product ready for sale. A bit out from the actual market, physically, we're talking a few miles, the traders would remove the shackles and chains in an attempt for injuries to heal. Probably one of the few baths that were offered was taken in readying for the sale. Gray hair on individuals was dyed or blackened or plucked, beard shaved, and skin was oiled. Once actually in the slave pens at the market, then individuals were given increased rations of bacon, butter, milk, what many agriculturalists would call a fattening diet. Very much treated similar to livestock when getting ready for auction. There would be the occasional doctor visit to those in the pens. The sick were treated, so to speak, and often housed away from the others. Frequency is hard to track. How often doctors visited, hard to tell. Level of care is hard to track. But the overall intent is to keep profit loss at a minimum. In the case of Harriet, slave held in one of the pens, a doctor would write this about her care, quote, "Capsules for Harriet on February 3rd. Cupping Harriet on the 5th, Burial of her child on the 14th. Brandy for Harriet on the 16th. Burial for Harriet on the 19th. Sale of Harriet's surviving children on the 21st. The market moves. The market simply continues. Business does not stop. That doctor, once realizing that Harriet was not going to respond to the treatments provided, it was simply a matter of comfort and or to keep her sedated so as to not disturb the rest of the sale process. Account and ledger books also note the donning of new clothes. Remember we talked about Franklin and Armfield. They would also parcel out on some of their ledgers or their bills of sale clothing for each individual. Now these individuals would finally don those new clothes. Those clothes were not intended for the trip down, but it was intended for the sale. Dresses, stockings, head coverings for women, suits and hats for the men. In October of 1857, John White, a trader, bought 40 identical suits for the individuals he was going to sell. Reason for that, uniformity conceals damaged goods. If everyone looks the same, in theory, no one stands out with any problems. It was also a mental game that was played in that many of the traders hoped that new clothes momentarily erased the depravity of those individuals' situations. Depending on where the buying and selling trading was taking place, it could be in rooms, it could be in large pens, it could be a number of places, markets. Sometimes women were lined up against one wall, men on the other, children upon a third. If it had not already happened, this is where families are once more torn apart. Both were there with a purpose, the buyer and the trader. The buyer to purchase an individual that would be a solid return on investment, the seller to sell, quote, for the best of his seller's interests, if he's acting as an agent for that individual. To delve a little further into this, there is actually, at least in Louisiana, there was a code which business individuals could follow that would potentially support sales and also, in a sense, the return practices of individuals. So, known as the Code Noir, or the Black Code, there's many amendments in it. One of them, though, talks about this. It prohibited the sale or the separation by sale of children under the age of 10 from their mothers. Now, on paper, if you can, within this whole institution, that might sound somewhat promising. However, it was really designed more for the buyer, so to speak, because it only applied to Louisiana. It didn't apply to Alexandria, where those individuals were separated out of the get-go. If it didn't happen in Louisiana, then one was following the Code Noir. But if it happened in Alexandria, it did not matter as a result. It really was to protect the sellers. That way they could rip families apart out there, but keep them, or at least in some part, protect themselves in New Orleans. They could also be grouped, and this relates to price, by a visual examination of skin color. Nothing to do with ethnicity, nothing to do with where one is from, nothing to do with familial relations, but everything about what is this initial survey I can do of you. Once they're segregated by sex and age, they're grouped according to color. Most acts of sale, at least we're talking about the New Orleans market, would contain words such as Negro, Griff, Mulatto, Quadroon, even Octoroon. There's a project, the LSU's Free People of Color in Louisiana, Revealing an Unknown Past, that defines these terms in this fashion. Keep in mind, these are estimations. No one's doing a genealogical survey, a family tree of someone to find out who exactly your parents, your paternal lineage, or your maternal lineage is. It's all about how you appear on the outside, not what your DNA tells us. And so the term Negro that we've been using in the quotes and you've seen on some of the advertisements and such is simply a term that talks about skin color. It has nothing to do with ethnicity or race. It's simply, what does one look like? The definitions here, you can see that it's most often is thought to be, is believed to be, potentially a person of, were they often intertwined? You bet. There is no way, and they're all quite subjective. They would, though, affect price. They are constructed categories of the marketplace. That we needed some way, the traders needed some way to price and or evaluate these individuals. So you've got to make categories, and you ascribe these categories. 3/4 of the individuals in the domestic slavery, which would be a house slave, someone working inside the home, or maybe a trade, would be light-skinned. The darker skin, whether male or female, for these traders instantly indicated field work. It was thought that these individuals worked better in those conditions. It was thought that they were hardier for those conditions, and it was also thought that if one had light skin, they were more in tune with a trade, blacksmithing, coopering, a variety of things. Children are going to be many times priced by an age to height ratio. So keep in mind, it's not necessarily about how old you are, but it's about how big you are and what can you do. Because what is the end goal for these buyers? It's to exact work out of these individuals. In fact, William Chambers, who went to a Richmond slave market, was handed a paper which listed the prices of children according to height. That was it. Simply by height, here's a price. Buyers not only conducted visual assessments of their products, but physical ones as well. They would manipulate joints. They would feel these individuals for muscle mass and check for hidden injuries, which was quite commonplace. Buyers would look for the presence and quality of teeth, as well as gum color, for whatever that might tell someone. A grayish color to them likely indicated illness. Both men's and women's bodies were valued in various fashions. Buyers believed individuals with darker skin tones, again, working better at the fields. Those with lighter tones working in the home. Some buyers were looking for specific physical attributes. One buyer would write this to their agent, quote, half men and half women, young, say 16 to 25, stout limbs, large deep chests, wide shoulders and hips, etc. In this case, this individual was, quote, was looking for, quote, the right sort. Women are going to be checked. They're going to be looking for a couple things. Breasts and abdomens palpated in search for her ability to bear children or an indication of children yet to be born. Buyers were many times looking for a boy large enough to plow and a girl large enough to nurse. Further evaluation required that buyers truly see what they were purchasing. Many times clothing was removed. Buyers would examine every inch of the men, women, and children before them. In some instances, both men and women taken into back rooms to be examined much more thoroughly. Deformities from injury or illness could negate a purchase on the spot. Scars from whipping were instant deal breakers in a sale. Discussions and analysis of all parts of the human form were considered, as that person was standing there. Remember, the person's standing there, clothed or not. The buyers assessing the commodity before them. Would it work? Would it ensure them profit? Was it worth the investment? Since the entire foundation of the trading and buying system was centered on a constructed market, the traders and to some degree the buyers they had to reconstruct now what someone was buying. This is the ultimate, just, I think, irony of the whole thing, in that you take someone, you ascribe them a price, you ascribe them a cost, you're ripping them away from family. At that point, they are almost inhuman. They are treated as livestock. Yet now, in order for you to sell that person in the market, what do you have to do? You have to humanize them again. Here's what this person can do for you. They had to reconstruct the people now being offered for a price. First-rate cook, experienced drayman, excellent field hand. One would write, quote, Bill, Negro man, aged about 28 years, excellent servant and good pastry cook. They had to have some skill, something about them, some story about them. Why else would you buy them? What else would you be looking for? The traders needed to establish a sense of legitimacy when it came to these individuals. Pitches were designed from all angles. Quote, faithful and loyal servant. That spoke to the paternalism of the whole industry. Trustworthy. That spoke to an owner not having to worry about them, in theory. Or the buyer could glow in the idea that from the evil that was the trade, they could purchase individuals who were family, thereby satisfying the desire to be considered, quote, a kind master. So one can participate in this, and one can, in many of the buyer's minds, be considered kind by performing various acts during purchase. One of the constructed, or I would say one of the illustrative things that we can look at, kind of drill down, maybe a case study is a good word, about this constructed or reconstructed identity is Charles Ball. Now, Charles Ball was born into slavery on a Maryland tobacco plantation sometime around 1781. In 1785, the owner's death forced a sale. Ball was sold to a gentleman named Jack Cox, who, in Ball's words, quote, treated him with humanity. At age 12, when Cox dies, Ball is sold again to a much more severe owner this time. When he's approximately 20, around the year 1800, Ball's master hired him out to the Navy, where he is stationed as a cook aboard the USS Congress. He will receive hand-me-down clothing, spending money. After nearly 2 years in the service of the Navy, Ball will meet a free man of color and will hopefully concoct a scheme to escape. Devising a plan to smuggle Ball to freedom in the North, it was rapidly undone when, as fate would have it, Ball's former master returned to reclaim him and sell him again, eventually away from his family down to South Carolina. After 7 years in slavery, Ball escapes back up to Maryland to be closer to his family. Declaring himself a free man, Ball worked at small farms until the War of 1812, broke out. He could have secured his freedom by joining with the British and being evacuated from the United States, but instead he chose to stay and enlist. He served as a seaman and cook in the Chesapeake Flotilla, served in the Battle of Gettysburg, and later he helped at the defenses of Baltimore. After the war, he remained in Baltimore, living as a free man, eventually purchasing land for a home. This would be short, however, as by 1830, he was caught again and returned back to slavery in Georgia. Ball is going to be one of those individuals when we were talking about being in the market and standing there, hearing people discuss what you are worth, what you are likely. He was one that was standing there in this market, and he would write that as he was standing there, overheard he was worth $1,000, quote, to a man making a settlement and clearing a plantation. Another gentleman, John Parker, had been dressed in such a manner that he presumed he was to be sold as a domestic slave versus one in the field. He had maybe no experience in any domestic trade, but that is what the seller is marketing him as. Henry Bibb, who had light skin, and who might tend toward a domestic sale was told to, quote, act stupid in language and thought, as the seller needed to move his merchandise, and there was no demand for house slaves at that point. So, what's one to do? You fit something into the market. Just as the buyers were eyeing up men and women and children as merchandise, so too were individuals attempting an evaluation, an impression, an estimation of the person before them. Those individuals up on the auction block also were surveying the scene. While they are in a horrendous situation, they are also, as best they can, trying to take some sort of agency within. And as Charles Baugh would note, he said, quote, I never saw a human countenance that expressed more of the evil passions of the heart than did that of this man, and his conversation corresponded with his physiognomy. What Baugh is doing is he's surveying the scene as well. Just as those buyers and sellers are surveying him, he is looking at the countenance, the face of every buyer. He is trying to figure out, what is this person's intentions? What is this person's intentions? Where might I have the best chance of self-preservation? Because that's really the only thing that he can do. Can he, in some shape, form, or fashion, also negotiate the sale? Now, we don't want to give too much, I don't want to say power to that, but I mean, he's stuck within this world. But there might be some things that he and other individuals could do or have done that could help direct that sale. Doesn't always happen, but any chance that anyone might have to improve that situation, I think they would probably try to take. There were times when the buyers would not only take people from plantations, but they would just take people in general. There were those that were made slaves by the traders. There were a lot of individuals who were slaves and then were taken by the interstate slave trade and moved to a different area, bought, sold to a different area. There were free people who became part of the interstate slave trade simply because someone was able to capture them, round them up, and force them into the interstate slave trade. Individuals like John Mercy of Illinois, captured in St. Louis and sold in New Orleans. Solomon Northup, free man from New York, lured to D.C., if you are familiar with the 12 Years a Slave. Albert Young, freed by his Alabama owner upon his death, but that was completely ignored, and he was taken to New Orleans to be sold. Some, because of their free status, were able to use the legal system to gain their freedom. Again, a majority not, however. Oh, we did that. Okay. The men, women, and children being sold, as I briefly mentioned, and to some degree, had to also actively participate in these sales, more as a means of self-preservation of themselves or of their loved ones. Unfortunately, many times traders would force people to dance. It supposedly demonstrated muscle tone and agility, run across the room, twist, demonstrate joint fluidity. If they did not do as told, it could not only affect them, but it could also affect the sale of family members. They were told to ignore past illnesses, lie about their age, and exaggerate their skills and abilities. Look happy, be energetic, and sing, be lively. Buyers could easily be misled by their performance before them. While traders and buyers were examining, probing, and violating and discussing their transaction, all the while, there has been a person at the center. A person that had from the outside shifted from a human to a commodity, and from the inside had to try and find something, a coping mechanism, a will, a spirit, to process their thoughts and their emotions as a means of survival. William Wells Brown described the slaves dancing to music, quote, "Their cheeks were wet with tears. So I don't think that speaks to the being lively, being happy, being energetic. Others caught up in the pricing and banter took umbrage at the loss of a few dollars on their price. As one of the authors of academic works on this subject, he would note, quote, people forced to perform their own commodification, which basically placed these individuals, these men, women, and children, acquiescing to the sale, which might mean that they imply or they agree with the idea of humans as property, or attempting to subvert the sale, which could have horrible consequences for them or their family. The middle ground of managing the sale was, for some, their only chance at some level of agency, some level of control, some level of self-preservation. They could revolt. They could fight back. They could resist. Most of the time done through violence. Jesse, an enslaved man from Virginia, secured knives, an axe, and a hatchet, and went looking for the trader upon hearing of the sale of himself and his wife. In 1799, 2 Georgia traders had their throats slit while moving a coffle outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. One group of men, being marched south through Kentucky, were momentarily able to overthrow the traders, killing 2 out of 3, but soon they were captured. On the seas, the Creole saw an uprising in 1841 where 135 slaves killed the trader and forced the captain to sail to the Bahamas. On a flatboat heading down the Ohio River, 75 slaves killed all 5 white men on board. Individuals rioted in Alexandria. A man in Mississippi ran away 6 times within a week and slit his jailer's throat. And one woman, fending off a rape by a speculator, seized a knife and sterilized him. He died the next day, and she was eventually granted her freedom. But those numbers, 135 slaves, 75 slaves, individuals, are a small portion of those that were able to, at least in attempt, to overthrow their situation and potentially gain their freedom, or at least, at minimum, go back to their families. Those being the exceptions, not the norm, as I said. During the time between the end of the, transatlantic slave trade, the shift in plantation economics, and the beginning of the Civil War, as we said earlier, about 600,000 people were forcibly exported from their existence in the Upper South and sent downriver to the Lower South. The traders would have you see what's before you. Words that describe business, livelihood, and their job. I would hope that at the end of this program, we might be able to see, if we can get it going, the people that were the center of the interstate slave trade. Not the bills of sale, not the bill of lading, not the price, but the fact that each of these individuals had a parent, may have had a child, and had a family that was forcibly ripped from them. And with that, I'll conclude our program today. I would like to thank everybody for coming out. If you have any questions, I'll obviously be here for a little bit to chat, but thank you for coming out. Thank you for being part of the Winter Lecture Series, and I hope you have a good afternoon.